again, I want to emphasize, folks, and somehow I forgot to say this the other class, but we'll be saying today. The Mongolians used gunpowder to overcome the Chinese. The Chinese had invented the gunpowder and gave it to the Mongolians. Again, this story might sound familiar in that our enemies were once weaponless and defenseless. We gave them the weapons. Now they're turning on us and shooting at us with the weapons that we supply.
I feel like that's what we get.
What's that?
I feel like that's what we get.
All right. Yeah, apparently he did not really finish the job of conquering China, but he started it. All right. Gunpowder started out by being something you put on the end of a stick and throw it like a fire lance. In other words, you light the stick with the gunpowder and then throw it. But eventually they found out better ways to build it, to make it and burn it. And eventually developed a cannon. The cannon was invented first, and then eventually the handgun. But the invention of the handgun and the cannon, which would likely have saved China from the Mongolians, came too late to save them. The Mongolians overran them before the Chinese had perfected the. It may seem like something simple, but folk, even something simple as a cannon can take years and years to perfect. I mean, you've got to make sure that the thing won't blow itself up while you're firing it. You've got to get the right kind of metals, the right size of ball, be able to manufacture them in abundance. I mean, there's a lot to it. And many a cannon, a person would shoot a cannon that would blow right up in their face and kill the shooter. Happened many a time. Speaking of which, yesterday afternoon we had a rocket get a few feet off the ground and blow itself to smithereens. It still happens, folks. All right, anyway. Your book then goes on to describe Mongol rule in China. That the Mongolians came in, they reconquered Vietnam, went to the Red River Valley, which is part of Vietnam. They went, well, their success in Vietnam was only temporary. The Vietnamese, and we're going to talk about this in a few chapters, but I'm going to introduce you here. The Vietnamese began to use guerrilla tactics against the Mongolians, which the Mongolians could not fight very well. I mean, the Mongolians had the same problem that the Vietnam had. Fighting in a jungle is one thing, and the Vietnamese knew how to fight in the jungle. Essentially, they hit and run. Hit and run. It's called guerrilla warfare. They used that against the United States, and they've gone down in history as the only nation to defeat the United States in war. It's called, again, guerrilla warfare. It's a dirty type of warfare where you hit a person and disappear. Hit a person and disappear. And an army marching along, they'll be marching along, with a sudden bang, the soldier drops dead. Marching along a few more feet, bang, another soldier beside you. And after a while, you say, oh, who's going to be next? But they could use guerrilla warfare even without guns. They'd simply appear out of a bunch of thick grass, strike a person dead with a sword or a spear, and vanish before the rest of the group had any time to react.
And they had tunnels too, right?
They probably did. They had in Vietnam, in our modern day Vietnam War. They might have had it this time, but the Mongolians initially conquered Vietnam and then lost it. Now, then they tried to conquer Japan. They sent a large fleet that might have had success against the Japanese, but a storm came up, which they called a kamikaze. I'm going to Now, when are we going to see this word kamikaze again? World War II. Japanese suicide fighters called themselves the kamikaze, otherwise known as divine wind. A big storm came up and destroyed the Chinese fleet. And the Japanese were waiting for them. Of course, the Japanese had their feet firmly on dry ground. The storm did not hurt them. It destroyed the fleet. It reminds me of a story we've come to in England where the King of Spain sent a big fleet to England called the Spanish Armada. The year is 1588, and a big storm came up. The Spanish galleons, if you think this galleon looks top-heavy, they were. The storm was of just the right size. It was terrifying to the galleons and did not really bother the English ships, the smaller English ships. And the English ships could just move in, set a galleon on fire, and back away. Move into another one, set another galleon on fire. You might say, why couldn't the galleons fight back? Their sailors were too terrified of the storm. Anyway, kamikaze, divine wind. Kublai Khan had somehow become a Buddhist. He remained a Buddhist, but he realized that most of the Chinese people were Confucians, so he restored the cult of Confucius and allowed it. That is one reason that the Yuan dynasty or the Mongol dynasty had the success it had, was they recognized Chinese traditions and allowed the Chinese to keep a lot of their traditions with themselves, the Mongolians, as overlords. The Mongolians kept having their own laws. They could remain a separate class. The highest positions in the government were held by the Mongolians. The Chinese-born person had little chance of rising up in the bureaucracy. All the jobs, high-up government jobs, were held by Mongolians. The Mongolians adopted a practice from Tibet where if you know anything at all about Tibet, folk, it's a land that has been a land of a lot of superstition and magic down through the ages. And on a very personal note, when I was a kid, my favorite comic book character was Doctor Strange. And Doctor Strange originated in Tibet, in folklore, that is, because Tibet was a land where the mystical arts were practiced. And if you go to Tibet today, you'll meet some young men who look like they're about your age, but who claim to be 120, 130 years old. Again, they're Taoist. The problem is you cannot document their births. And it's likely they are not that old, but they'll claim that. Now, if any of you know any different or have heard any different, you're welcome to speak up. But it's still a land of magic, and the Chinese, the Yuan emperors began to call these people in from Tibet. I really do not know if the Mongol rulers conquered Tibet or not, but they did emphasize a lot of divination and magic. Again, the Mongolians continued the prosperity of the song, and a lot of people, that's one reason they were able to last as long as they did. Now, as is the case of all dynasties, eventually the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol dynasty, came to an end. But your book shows, and I'm looking at page 286, some of the trade routes that the Chinese goods took to get west, and eventually a certain trade route went all the way to Italy, and this influenced Marco Polo to, actually no, that is not the trade, that's the route of Marco Polo. Now I'm looking closer at my mistake. But Marco Polo, actually, he took the land route going there, and then took the water route coming home. The water route, of course, involves a whole lot less footwork, is a lot easier. And if your ship stays free from disease, you have a better chance of making it back. But they took the water route around the Malay Peninsula, around India, up the Persian Gulf, and then got off the boat went up the Euphrates River to Turkey, then got on board a ship there and went from there back to Italy. All right. The Mongol eventually gave way to the Ming Dynasty, as I mentioned. They eventually fell out of favor, as did all Chinese. The Chinese believed that heaven appointed the dynasties. When they were through with that dynasty, heaven would reject that dynasty and appoint a new one. I'm going to move on to In Search of the Way. The way, there's a Chinese word way, is there the word Da, or way. Confucius believed everyone had his own Da, or his own way. Essentially what happened in one sentence, Buddhism and Taoism declined, and Confucianism wound up triumphing. Why? In part because, as was the case of India, in India, where that the main religion, the old religion, Hinduism, had to make modifications, Confucianism realized that a lot of people in China were seeking more spirituality than initially Confucius offered. So they adapted Confucius and made it more spiritual. And they got their converts eventually to come back to Confucianism. They called their new religion, or we call their new religion, Neo-Confucianism. It was designed to unite the metaphysical parts of Buddhism and Taoism, or the spiritual aspect of it, incorporate it into Confucianism in an attempt to get the Taoists and the Buddhists to come back into the Confucian. And Confucianism was to triumph and become the religion of China until the year 1949. They had theological squabbles. A scholar named Yang Wangmang believed one way. You can read it for yourself. Another scholar came along and said, no, I disagree with that, and he believed another. Essentially, the issue was what constitutes a good life, what constitutes happiness, what constitutes a way to a happy after existence. And was it self-examination, or was it the right thoughts? And another issue is it spiritual, a spiritual mind, or is it a worldly mind? And again, the Greeks had argued this, Christians have argued it, and the Chinese argued it. All right. Your book goes on to discuss Chinese literature. The one thing I want to say about Chinese literature, you might have heard that Robinson Crusoe was a first novel. Swiss Family Robinson followed soon after. Actually, the Chinese wrote the first novels before Robinson Crusoe. The novel folk cannot come into existence until you have the printing press first. Why? Because stories depend on somebody copying in a studio, otherwise on the wide following. With the invention of press, a person could write a long, basically the word novel means it was long story. You could write a novel, make several copies of it, and distribute them far and wide. The Chinese were doing this before the Europeans had the printing press. Your book gives some examples of some of the novels. Don't worry about learning so much. Your book gives some examples of Chinese art. There have been persons. Art, again, I can't emphasize how important it is. I had a student do a paper on the art that the Germans stole. One of the things Hitler did when he moved into the country was steal their art. When World War II was over, there were attempts made to get all the art, lost art back to its owner. But from time to time, and I saw as recently as this year, where that some artworks had been found, had been stolen by the Nazis, and they said, we're going to do our best to get these artworks back to their rightful owners, who are now deceased, but get to their families at least, their descendants. Art is the expression, they might say, of the soul of a society, the inner person of society. Any of you take art will learn about this perhaps more than I do. And there have been attempts to compare how can you compare Chinese art to European art. Regrettably, I don't know enough about the topic, and I will admit, to really make a lot of comments on it. But again, about when we talk about literature and art, just be aware the Chinese invented the novel, among other things. Again, I had to follow the invention of the printing press. All right.